Dun dun dun
In Octopussy.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4Ks. And what I plan to do in this video is give everybody out there definitive proof, and I mean definitive proof, that at the very least there were two different knives used in the attack, even though I believe all the evidence has led me to believe there was 4 different knives used in the attack. But what I'm going to do in this one is keep it simple, right? Old motto is the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. So I'm going to keep it really simple, and I'm going to give definitive proof for anybody out there that thinks that this crime was committed by Bryan Kohberger carrying a K-bar knife and Bryan Kohberger alone carrying 1 K-bar knife. It's definitive proof that that is impossible. And by the end of this video, I think you will agree. There are certain wounds on each one of these victims that disprove this theory beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I know that the pathologist in this case had to know this as well. That's why when I do these videos, and I know I've been stuck on the autopsies for all the victims here for some time now. And if you recall, I did the same thing when they released the forensic reports along with the crime scene photos of each and every blood sample that was tested for DNA and each and every marker that they had in the house. I focused on it a lot. And that's because for years, we've all wondered what really went on during this crime. In my humble opinion, there's only a couple of things that can really lead us to the truth as far as real evidence in this case. One being the photos of all of the blood that was tested in this case, the results from those tests, and now with the release of the forensic pathologist report, being able to go through and understand each and every wound on the victims in relation to all the other things I've just discussed, I feel is imperative for you to really understand what took place and to back up some of the assertions that I've made in the past and see what I got right and what I got wrong, because I believe I got a lot right and I believe I got a couple of things wrong based on these new findings. And the reason that I have to make video after video about roughly the same thing, but breaking it down to the minute details, is because that's what helps me to memorize everything about this case. The actual process of making the videos and breaking the things down, I do it twofold. One, to educate the public on real truth in the case, but also so that I can wrap my mind around real facts in the case. And by doing it in videos and making the videos, it really helps me to do that. And in reality, I do it mainly for me to understand what really went on in this crime. But it gives me the ability to do some things by doing that. And instead of going through 160 something wounds on victims, what I can do now that I have broken down every single wound is I can easily, because I have slides on every single wound, I can easily compare wounds with specific markings from specific victims in a very quick fashion to be able to put together some easily understandable things for the public. But again, in this one, I'm going to prove, because I think it's imperative for people to understand. Once you understand, and you will for sure by the end of this video, that there was at the very least 2 proven identifiable knives used in this case, at least. Once you understand that, you understand that Bryan Kohberger is not an octopus. There's no way that he had a sharp force object in one hand, a sharp force object in the other hand, a sheath in the other hand, a blunt force object in another hand. Apparently, according to the roommates, a vacuum cleaner in one hand, and in one instance, they describe it as a gun. I mean, Brian Koberger does not have that many hands. So once you understand there was two knives used, then you can at least acknowledge that this was a multiple perpetrator crime. Once you do that, then you look into the facts deeper and you realize there was more than two perpetrators and there was more than two murder weapons. Once you do that, then you realize that what we've been told has been a lie. What you believe about this case has been a lie. And then you can dig into the fine details to determine the truth, in my humble opinion. Hold on to your hats, folks, because we're going to take hypothesis and turn it into proven theory. Ready, go. Okay, so what we have here is a one-sided knife that's measured exactly 1¼ inches from tip until 1¼ inches up, and the blue sticker indicates exactly 1¼ inches. This is a one-sided knife with the other side sharp with partially fine serrated edge. What we have here is the clip point of a K-bar showing one side being sharp and the other side being fairly sharp, because unless you actually file down the other side of the K-bar, then it's not quite as sharp as the sharp side. Now what we have here is some Play-Doh. What we're going to do is take our K-bar and insert it and you see it's exactly on the line. Now you can see the double-sided edge that are sharp on both sides. Now we're going to take the butcher style knife and repeat the process. Now we'll see a clear difference between the butcher style knife blade and the clip point on the K-bar. Although there's many different ways I could go about this, I'm going to do this in the simplest way possible just to prove that there was a minimum of two knives used on each victim in this case, and it's undisputable proof. As I just showed you with the example of the marks made by different knives as it relates to sharp on both sides and flat on one side and sharp on the other. And I made sure that I created all of the samples with a 1½ inch tip on the K-bar, because that is going to be the deepest wound that we'll find in my proof examples. And anybody that watches this can understand it very easily. You have two different types of knives with two different orientations of blades. So you have the clip point K-bar with the double-sided edge, and then my other example here is just a standard butcher knife with a finely serrated edge that is flat on one side and sharp on the other. And those are the exact knives, except for the serrades on the K-bar. I did not get it near far enough for that to even come into play, but those are the exact knives that I have used in my scientific example. And when you insert these knives up to 1½ inches or 1¼ it's going to leave distinct markings between the two different knives that are indistinguishable. There are at minimum 2 wounds on each victim that proves this hypothesis to be a actual theory that is proven. I think you'll agree. This wound on Maddie's head is a stab wound oriented from 7 to 2. The 7 o'clock end is squared, the 2 o'clock end is sharp, but at 1 1/4 inches deep with a clip point K-bar, as I just showed you at 1 1/2. It gives you a clear definition of a 2 sides being sharp, not the 7 o'clock end being squared. This is verifiable proof that this stab wound did not come from a K-bar blade. And if you need more to verify that, we can simply go to the wound on the other side of Maddie's scalp, and it is another stab wound. This one only 3/4 of an inch deep, and you can see that both ends are sharp, oriented from 9 to 3. Both ends are sharp at 3/4 of an inch. Just like I showed you in the demonstration with the K-bar, both ends are still sharp at 1.5 inches. Definitive proof that 2 different knives made 2 different wounds on Maddie's scalp. Kaylee, we have verifiable evidence of this as well. We can simply go to the stab wound on the right temple of Kaylee that was oriented from 12 to 6. The 12 o'clock end is squared, the 6 o'clock end is sharp, and it's only 1 inch deep. 1 inch deep on the K-bar, as we just showed with a 1 1/2 inch example, absolutely shows 2 sharp ends. This knife, this wound, if it was created by the K-bar, would not have a square end at 12 o'clock. Undeniable proof that a knife without a clip point blade caused this wound. And just to verify, we'll go to the wound on her left posterior upper arm. And again, it is oriented from 8 to 2, just like you see demonstrated here. The 8 o'clock end is squared. The 2 o'clock end is sharp at 3/4 of an inch. 8 o'clock end is squared, 2 o'clock end is sharp. If it was a clip point on the K-bar, you would have sharp sides on both. Ethan, we have proof both ways again. On Ethan's left neck, stab wound, the 10 o'clock end is squared, the 4 o'clock end is sharp. It's oriented from 10 to 4, square, sharp, depth at 1 1/2 inches. As I just demonstrated on the Play-Doh, at 1 1/2 inches with the clip point K-bar, you would have sharp ends on both sides. Not a clip point K-bar. However, the wound on his inner thigh, his medial right thigh, oriented from 9 to 3, just like you see here, it's only 1 inch deep. Both ends are sharp. At 1 inch deep, you got both ends sharp, consistent with the clip point on a K-bar. Unlike the wound on his neck that was 1 1/2 inches deep and was squared on one end. Impossible if it was a K-bar, as proven in our demonstration. Two different wounds from 2 different knives made on Ethan. Finally, we have Zana with 3 examples that are measurable to prove the theory. First one is a stab wound on the forehead, on the left forehead, 3/4 of an inch deep, oriented from 10 to 4. The 4 o'clock end is sharp. The 10 o'clock end is squared. At 3/4 of an inch deep, as proven by the demonstration on a K-bar, both ends would be sharp. Not a K-bar making this wound. We have another example on her upper right neck. It's 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock on the wound, but the 10 o'clock end is sharp. The 4 o'clock end is squared at 1¼ inches. As demonstrated, at 1½ inches, the K-bar shows 2 sharp-sided blades. So at 1¼ inches, a K-bar could not make a wound with a squared end on one side. And just to prove it out, there is another wound on the lower right neck of Zana that was 1¼ inches deep, oriented from 11 to 5, and you guessed it, both ends are sharp. The 1¼ inches deep on the K-bar, is demonstrated in our example, absolutely shows sharp sides on both ends. At 1¼ even sharp sides on both ends at 1½ So you've got a 1¼ inch wound consistent with the clip point blade of the K-bar. You got a 1¼ inch wound inconsistent with the double-sided point of the K-bar. One end is sharp, 4 o'clock end is squared. How do you have 2 wounds exactly the same depth with 2 different types of blades clearly, and try to claim one knife was used in this crime? Another example here at 3/4 inch could not be the K-bar. The shorter we go on depth, the more definition the K-bar has with sides that are pointed on both sides sharp. What have we been told for so long? Trust the science. Trust the science. Well, that's why I have a big problem with the pathologist's findings in this case as it relates to the K-bar being consistent with all the wounds of the victims. You see, that was his final report where he took his eyeball or her eyeballs, looked at it and said, yeah, I think it's consistent with the wounds. When in reality, at the end of each victim's autopsy results, the pathologist lists possible knives and dimensions of possible knives that could be consistent with the wounds. If you go through each of those victims individually, you'll see that most of the dimensions that the pathologist lists as being a possible knife that could have caused the wounds are not consistent with the width and dimensions of the K-bar blade. In most cases, the pathologist says that the width of the blade, the minimum width of the blade, is wider than the K-bar. So for the final conclusion of the K-bar could have been consistent with the wounds that created consistent with the weapon that created the wounds on the victims, it's my determination that he is maybe talking about one victim. Certainly isn't encompassing all of the victims in the case, which is very strange to me. In fact, it's very, very strange to me. And it reminds me of when Bill Thompson was going through the sentencing hearing and making the statements that Mr. Kohberger, I don't believe, was going in there to unalive all of the victims. And I think it comes down to the fact that they were holding Brian Kohberger responsible for one of the victims in the case and holding him half responsible for the rest. They're just hiding the entire case from us. But I believe, based on all the evidence in this case, the one victim that they may have been trying to tie Brian Kohberger to was incorrect as well, because there is new evidence out now around the only piece of evidence they ever had in the case against Kohberger, which was touch DNA on a knife sheath that may or may not have been his, that shows the manipulation of that sample in great detail. We'll bring that to you soon, but I do have a couple of other videos that I need to get to you before then to really wrap up what these autopsy results actually showed us. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms, and until next time, Paparazzi's out.